Right, and I'll just start getting a full screen view for you. And I think we're away. I'd like to say a big welcome to Robin, who is Emeritus Professor of Philosophy at Cardiff University. And this is a great presentation around his new book on the ethics of the climate crisis, which I think is such a topic of interest that I'm really looking forward to finding out so much more about the ethical dilemmas I think we probably are facing that are coming up. So, Robin, if I can then ask you to introduce yourself and away you go. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian. Um, yes, I see there's a message from Rebecca already. Um, well, the book just mentioned, The Ethics of the Climate Crisis, came out in April this year in the United Kingdom and in July in the United States. Could we have the next slide, please? Well done. Um, And as will emerge, it owes some amount to a presentation to the Schumacher Institute from Julian Caldicott in 2022, because this book was being written around then and somewhat afterwards. Could we move on to the next slide, please? So I can relate that one of the minor policy recommendations of the book was actually implemented by the then United Kingdom government before publication. So, of course, it wasn't in any way due to the book. But that's the kind of thing that can happen when when authors are writing about current events and issues. Philosophers are not usually writing about current events and issues, so there being any kind of fulfillment of recommendations is a considerable surprise. Can we move on to the next slide still, please? Good. Um, Now, my book does not seek to improve on the scientific work of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, or of its leaders of the recent past, such as the late Sir John Horton, whose book, Global Warming, the Complete Briefing, attained its fifth edition in 2015. I learned this morning that sadly he died in 2020. Now, could we move to the next slide, please? I am not a scientist, but an ethicist. But my book, in urging that we, that is, citizens, companies, local authorities, and national governments, are ethically obliged to take action to mitigate global heating and to adapt to its impacts where they are by now irreversible, needs first to set out the findings of IPCC science, and thus to contest climate skepticism in its various forms. For some people deny that global warming is real, others that it is largely caused by human actions, and others again that responding to it is an urgent priority, suggesting rather that it can be deferred until other priorities have been resolved. Yet, where the other priorities concern alleviating poverty, it's important to recognize that poverty is widely being exacerbated by climate change, and that issues of climate and of poverty need to be addressed together in an integrated manner, as indeed the people whose works are depicted on the screen would almost certainly agree. But since the findings of IPCC science are well known, together with the fact that their confidence that global heating is largely caused by humanity has itself grown in strength across successive reports, with earlier language saying that this was likely being replaced more recently by extremely likely, it may be more useful, excuse me, sorry, it may be more useful if, as in the book, um, I focus for the present on systems theory and tipping points, language also used in IPCC reports, but supplemented in recent work from scientists such as Rene Cho and this person I mentioned, Julian Caldicott. Cho, for example, who is the author of over 200 refereed papers, defines a tipping point as the point at which small changes become significant enough to cause a larger, more crucial change that can be abrupt, irreversible, and lead to cascading effects. Cho 2021. Using different language, the IPCC Physical Science Summary for Policymakers of 2021 relates that under sustained stress, systems, to quote, become increasingly likely to reach a critical threshold beyond which a system reorganizes, often abruptly and or irreversibly, unquote. That's from the IPCC report of 2021, which is cited by Julian Caldicott in his Schumacher working paper on his third page. But global heating plausibly does place many systems under sustained stress. And by systems, Caldicott is referring to such regional systems as ice caps, ice sheets, tropical forests, and boreal forests. Caldicott goes beyond the IPCC talk of critical thresholds to argue that there is a danger that if one system, such as the Amazon rainforest or the West Antarctic ice shield, reaches a tipping point, that could initiate a far-reaching cascade of other systems reaching their tipping points, with potentially global impacts on ocean currents and weather systems, and that this could take place within 2 or 3 decades. That's in Caldicott's 2 papers, his working paper and his paper that was published a few months later in the journal Discover Sustainability, both in 2022. While the IPCC have not gone as far as this, Caldicott's research directs attention to the importance of preserving systems like the boreal forests of Canada, Scandinavia, and Siberia, as well as tropical forests, as well as the ice shields of the Arctic, the West Antarctic, and of Greenland. Accordingly, the global impacts of global heating turn out to include more than the widely recognized effects. These widely recognized effects include, of course, rises of sea level and dangers to all coastlines and small islands, an increasing frequency and increasing severity of extreme weather events, such as storms, floods, droughts, famines, and wildfires, the vectors or carriers of tropical diseases spreading to higher altitudes and higher latitudes, and the migration of climate refugees and of wild species. But they also include nothing less than the collapse of regional systems, such as those just mentioned, and even possibly the curtailment or reversal of ocean currents. The full emergence of all these impacts is not inevitable, but without concerted global action, it is becoming increasingly likely. Could we have the next slide, please? So the ethics of the climate crisis is not confined to just one crisis, and spends a chapter depicting 2 allied crises with overlapping causes, the crises of biodiversity loss and of air pollution. In each case, I am perforce reliant on scientific sources. In each case, I also seek to present the findings of others in an accessible manner. Can we have the next slide, please? So it turns out that there has been a staggering loss of species and a huge reduction of the populations of many wild species across all continents and most kinds of ecosystems. Serious both for the human interests that depend on these species and for the creatures themselves, and the potential future creatures whose very existence has in many cases been curtailed. But instead of presenting statistics about all this, it may be better to present an example, the example of honeybees, which are widely suffering from what is called colony disorder syndrome, of which the immediate cause is not yet agreed. Honeybees remain essentially a wild species, but they pollinate a large proportion of horticultural and agricultural crops and cannot easily be replaced as pollinators. but it seems likely that the stress to which modern agriculture subjects them is one of the factors that leads to their hives becoming infertile. In places, their hives are ferried by lorry to pollinate one crop or another, such as almonds, and then a fortnight later transported elsewhere to pollinate some quite different crop, such as sunflowers. This mechanization of the lives of a wild species may well be one of the factors responsible for their decline. Here I'm mentioning the interpretation of the Australian philosopher Freya Matthews in her article of 2010, who suggests that the kind of pressure to which modern agribusiness is subjecting honeybees, leading perhaps to colony disorder syndrome, is symbolic of humanity's broader treatment of nature and producing what Freya Matthews has called planetary disorder syndrome. While it is far from certain that modern agriculture in general is responsible for anything of that scale, it is clear that the amount of deforestation taking place in the Amazon rainforest for mineral exploitation and in the rainforests of Malaysia and Indonesia to grow an ever-increasing monoculture of palm oil plantations is driving these rainforests close to transitioning, in the case of the Amazon rainforest, to a savanna, and in the case of Borneo, into a region where insufficient forest, insufficiently connected, is left for the survival of species such as orangutans that are native to those forests. Deforestation is also being driven by climate change, and so the crises of global heating and of biodiversity loss turn out to share common causes to some degree, which makes it all the more important, as I argue later in the book, to tackle the various greenhouse emissions that underlie global heating, as well as the other factors responsible for the loss of forests, economic and political forces included. Could we have the next slide, please? To turn now to air pollution, it emerges that all of the world's major conurbations and most of its major highways are seriously afflicted by gases such as nitrogen dioxide, carbon dioxide, and benzene, and also by invisible small particles or particulates produced by diesel emissions as well as by the wearing of tires. A wide range of Asian, African, American, and European cities have levels of these pollutants far above acceptable international levels, as also do the highways that link these cities. Since the problem results largely from the emissions of road transport vehicles, the causes of this problem are once again related to the emissions responsible for global heating. And the fact that a large proportion of pollutant emissions are generated in homes, offices, and factories in no way diminishes that link. As an illustration of the problem of air pollution, I mention in the same book the death of a 9-year-old girl, Ella Adukisi Deborah, who lived close to the South Circular Road in Lewisham, South London, and the related coroner's investigation. Ella had suffered serious health impacts from her walk to and from school, being hospitalized no less than 27 times, but was thought at the first coroner's inquiry after her death to be suffering simply from asthma. However, this finding was set aside when 5 years later in 2018, it was replaced by a new finding that her death was due to, quote, asthma contributed to by exposure to excessive air pollution, unquote. This was the first time that a British coroner's certificate specified levels of nitrogen dioxide as one of the causes of death. The same coroner, Philip Barlow, went on to find that levels of nitrogen dioxide near Ella's home, quote, exceeded World Health Organization and European Union guidelines, unquote, adding that there was, quote, a recognized failure to reduce the levels of nitrogen dioxide, which possibly contributed to her death. And he also added that another possible contribution to her death was the lack of information given to Ella's mother, unquote, but for which Ella might have been sent to a different school along a less polluted route. Of course, the nature and levels of local air pollution vary from place to place and from country to country, and so we cannot extrapolate globally from this single case. Yet this case illustrates the well-attested fact that the air of none of our cities is anywhere near safe to breathe, and that major traffic arteries can be death traps, however many green spaces are situated next to them. It also brings home the impacts of harmful airborne emissions, which are not confined to cities such as those of Mexico, Nigeria, Iran, and China, but are found even in such better regulated countries as the USA and Northern Europe, the United Kingdom included. My book proceeds to remark on the overlapping causes of the three crises that it depicts, and thus the importance of taking measures to counteract them. Next slide, please. By this stage, the book is suggesting that there are plentiful reasons for concerted action to address the shared causes of the three crises that have been depicted, and it is time for ethical issues to be confronted head on. The chapters on ethics and on politics that follow, however, need first to engage with the widespread skepticism about ethical reasoning, which widely issues in the view that ethical conclusions are nothing but subjective expressions of opinion and in no way more substantial. This kind of skepticism derived in part from the 18th century philosopher David Hume, who argued that there is no valid way of reasoning from what is, or from facts, to oughts. And it was revived by 20th century theorists, some of whom maintained that oughts are merely expressions of emotion, or differently, just described prescriptions. Next slide, please. Yet there is a growing consensus among philosophers that objective reasoning about what ought to be done is both possible and indeed widespread. What we need to realize, I suggest, and I'm doing a little bit of philosophy here, what we need to realize is that there are several kinds of ought, and that reasoning to and about oughts is best understood when it becomes clear whether particular oughts are technical oughts, legal oughts, aesthetic oughts, prudential oughts, or moral oughts. Technical oughts are based on what a reason, what I'll say that again. Technical oughts are based on what an agent has reason to do to undertake or complete some technical task, like attaching a car battery. Legal oughts concern what agents have reason to do to comply with their country's laws. Aesthetic oughts concern what agents have reason to do who want, say, to take a good photograph or compose a satisfactory piece of music or song. Prudential oughts concern what agents have reason to do for the sake of their own interests. And there are, of course, all kinds of professionals, such as financial advisors, who can give advice in such matters. Moral oughts, by parity, moral oughts concern what agents have reason to do if they are concerned about well-being, but this time, not only their own well-being, but that of the other parties affected as well. Not just any action answers to this description, and a great deal of reasoning is often in place in reaching a conclusion about a well-grounded moral or ethical ought. It was perhaps the apparent vagueness of oughts, when the kind of ought is left unspecified, that made the skeptical claims of Hume seem plausible. And there again, those of the 20th century emotivists and prescriptivists as well. There is room for argument, admittedly, at least at the fringes, about who or which affected parties, who the affected parties are, whose well-being needs to be taken into account. But hardly anyone disputes that the well-being of current human beings is relevant to moral oughts. And to see this is to grasp a good deal about ethical reasoning. At the bottom of the screen, I've put the phrase, the sentence, all these translations can be true at times and false at others. And what I'm saying there is that ought statements can be true or false, not that the translations can be defective, which would be a misunderstanding of what I meant. So I thought I'd better clarify that. Could we now have the next slide, please? So, whose well-being? More progress can be made by reflection on whether the well-being of future people is relevant as well. The stance for which I argue is that the foreseeable well-being interests of people across the foreseeable future are relevant. Most people regard the next generation or two as ethically important, and the conclusion I just mentioned simply enlarges this view to those groups of future people whose prospects can foreseeably be affected by current actions, policies, and practices. One implication of all this is that we should not, as some economists suggest, discount future interests by any significant annual discount rate, because that makes the interests of the people of 100 years hence count for very little indeed. Granted that in some regards the future impacts of current actions are uncertain, that is far from invariably the case for future people in general. And we should not pretend that most or all of the impact of our current emissions are cloaked in uncertainty when we have strong scientific evidence to the contrary. This is a good moment to add that moral oughts can reasonably take into account the well-being of members of other species as well as human well-being. This is increasingly a matter of consensus. I'm not claiming that all species should be treated alike or equally, and I recognize that the good of species with ampler ranges of capacities should be prioritized, with those bearing capacities such as self-consciousness receiving special attention. However, I argue against the scope of moral patience being regarded as corresponding to the limits of consciousness, since it makes good sense to discuss the well-being of creatures that may well lack consciousness, such as fish and invertebrates. Although a recent declaration maintained that it is likely that many of these, in fact, have sentience of some kind. And for the sake of symmetry, it's reasonable to add that if future human generations are to be included for their own sake in moral reasoning, so should future non-human generations. This will have to suffice for present purposes for the methods and structure of ethical thought. The first ethics chapter now returns to some more concrete issues. Could we have the next slide, please? First, it defends the precautionary principle, namely, that where there is reason to believe that actions or policies could cause considerable or extensive environmental damage, preventive action should be taken. This principle is defended against objections, such as that it would stultify all initiatives or far too many. It is also buttressed against proposed qualifications, such as that the best available technology must always be used. For many states would not be able to afford this, but should still arguably take action to prevent environmental disasters. The chapter also considers the view of the ethicist John Broome, who supports offsetting the carbon emissions resulting from one's flights, but holds that it is indifferent whether trees to be planted for the sake of offsetting are actually planted. It replies that the location of tree planting cannot be a matter of indifference, granted awareness that whole systems of forests, boreal as well as tropical, are at risk, and that the kind of planting that sustains or restores these forest systems makes much more difference than tree planting in, say, fields or parks. Appeal is here made to the systems science depicted above. The example is also given of the Cardiff-based charity Regrow Borneo, which funds connectivity, for example, to sustain connected forest along riverbanks in the endangered forests of Malaysian North Borneo, thus preserving both the forests and their inhabitants, and the orangutans come into that again. Could we now have the next slide, please? The following ethics chapter considers Who are the victims of climate injustice, and subsequently the shape of climate justice? The victims are argued to include developing countries, which disproportionately suffer from the increased severity and frequency of extreme climate events such as floods, droughts, and wildfires, without, in many cases, having contributed significantly to the causes of climate change. Some, of course, have contributed, but it tends to be the poor of these countries who have contributed little or nothing to climate change who suffer most from its impacts. This strengthens the case for developed countries whose prosperity widely results from past industrial activity and thus past emissions to contribute to climate mitigation and adaptation in developing countries. And even if the phrase is not used, this amounts to a case for climate reparations, recently tacitly acknowledged when at COP27 and COP28, it was internationally agreed to set up a loss and damage fund to assist developing countries faced with ongoing environmental damage. The language of compensation and of reparations was avoided for political reasons, but what matters is the reality of recompense rather than the language used about it. Another large set of victims of climate injustice are climate refugees. Unlike the victims of warfare and armed conflict, these refugees have no recognized international status. And yet their numbers are in millions, as droughts and floods make farming their traditional lands unsustainable. These refugees increasingly include the inhabitants of small islands, such as Kiribati and Tuvalu, whose entire territories are disappearing under the waves as sea levels rise. Possible forms of provision for these refugees are considered, including the suggestion that until a better solution is found, the Loss and Damage Fund could be deployed to provide for them. The third group of victims of climate injustice is identified as non-human species, some of which have been indirectly mentioned already in connection with biodiversity loss. This is where the book argues against anthropocentrism, the belief that only human interests matter, and in favor of biocentrism, the view that the interests of all living creatures are to be taken into account. Examples are given of the kind of practical difference that a biocentric approach can take. Thus, in space exploration, it requires explorers to show much greater restraint when visiting or otherwise influencing planets or moons that may possibly carry life than elsewhere. As for our own planet, it discourages mineral exploitation in the humanly uninhabited fastnesses of forests and mountain ranges in order to preserve the species resident there. There are usually some limited human interests at stake as well, such as satisfying scientific curiosity and the chance of finding medicines or food species. But the case becomes much stronger when the non-human ecological communities are also taken into account. There are also places, such as the lakes 2 miles below the Antarctic ice shield, that human action is capable of disturbing, but which should be preserved intact as long as we take into account their living inhabitants. Even without biocentrism, there is a strong case for measures to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions and to adapt to climate change. But biocentrism both strengthens that case and makes the case for preservation significantly wider in scope. Can we have the next slide, please? The second part of this chapter discusses the basis of climate justice. Sympathy is shown for the view that it is polluters who should pay for measures of mitigation and adaptation. But it is explained that just as many past individual polluters are no longer around to pay for their pollution, so too many polluting states no longer exist, such as the Austrian Empire, the Soviet Union, Yugoslavia, and the Ottoman Empire, the one picked out on this slide. To which list we could reasonably add the empires of Britain, France, Belgium, Spain, the Netherlands, and Portugal. Meanwhile, there are many states, whether oil-rich or not, that are well able to contribute and whose interest it is that there should be an effective concerted global effort to promote sustainable energy, counter mitigation, and facilitate climate adaptation. I should have said facilitate mitigation and climate adaptation. So the conclusion is drawn that all countries with the ability to pay should join in contributing, whether they have a history of past pollution or not. The nationally determined contributions, that's a technical term used in COP conferences, the nationally determined contributions of all states able to contribute should be ratcheted up in time for the COP29 conference of later this year, to which this matter is due to return. Parallel conclusions should be held about curtailing biodiversity loss. We need global agreements like the Kunming-Montreal Agreement of December 2022 on the preservation of seas, oceans, savannas, and forests. But in many cases, the biodiversity-rich countries lack the resources needed to fund preservation efforts, and it is often the more developed countries, which are often relatively poor in biodiversity, that can be expected to fund large parts of such programs. Next slide, please. To turn now to the chapter on political implications. The first section of this chapter is entitled Climate Responsibilities in a Non-Ideal World, and considers what one's country should do if other countries default, whether by refusing to collaborate all along or by backtracking on agreements they have entered into. This matter has been discussed by Rosa and Seidel in their book Climate Justice, an Introduction of 2017, and I endorse their finding that sooner than give up on attempts at global collaboration ourselves, we should be flexible enough to take up some of the slack without imposing on our own taxpayers payment of the unpaid bills of everyone else. Rosa and Seidel's treatment of this problem is worth further study. Mention is here made of the United Nations High Seas Treaty, in which it was agreed to preserve 30% of the oceans from fishing and from mineral exploitation. BBC News, 6th of March 2023. The extent to which this treaty will be implemented remains to be seen, this being a non-ideal world. But this agreement shows that the work of the Kunming-Montreal Conference is being taken forward, as the ethical conclusions of the previous chapter suggest that it should be. Not all the political implications depicted in the book can here be described or gone through, but it should be said that one has been adopted already. As mentioned earlier, through the UK and later the European Union, agreeing to withdraw from the capital letters European Energy Charter of 2015, which provided for companies to sue governments whose climate policies curtailed their activities or their profits, as when Italy attempted to ban offshore oil drilling close to the Italian coast. Actually, that was an attempt before Italy withdrew, but I think it motivated their withdrawal. The book lists 8 European countries that had withdrawn already, and I had argued that to facilitate national efforts of greenhouse gas mitigation, Britain too should withdraw. This actually came about towards the end of the long period between my book being handed to the publishers and actually being published this April. Next slide, please. So we come to the topic of ecocide. One implication yet to be realized should be mentioned next, the criminalization of the international crime of ecocide. Next slide again, please. The proposed international legislation that would criminalize ecocide defines ecocide as, and the definition is shown on that slide, unlawful or wanton acts committed in the knowledge that there is a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment being caused by these acts. Here, wanton means with reckless disregard, and all the various other terms have suitable legal interpretations. See Stop Ecocide International 2022. A large part of the point of this proposal is that one of the factors that explains non-compliance with the Paris Agreement on Climate Change of 2015 is the lack of any international law criminalizing acts of large-scale destruction of the environment. Thus, there is hardly any alternative to a change of international law. In the Statute of Rome, which governs crimes such as aggression and genocide, if that statute were to be amended to include ecocide, an immediate widespread impact on leading decision makers, such as company directors and government ministers, can be expected. Because of their likely concern to avoid reputational damage, the reputational damage of being hailed before the International Criminal Court and accused of an international crime. Indeed, the main impact of the criminalization of ecocide would be a deterrent one. The proposed crime is so worded as to target leaders of large organizations and governments rather than SMEs, small or medium enterprises, medium scale enterprises, and rather than private citizens who have gas boilers or who drive conventional cars. Certainly not all countries are signatories to the Statute of Rome, but if the amendment were carried, then even the prime ministers and presidents of non-signatory countries would be affected, as they could not travel to signatory countries, which number 123, which would be legally obliged to arrest them. Just as President Putin was unable to travel to a recent BRICS summit in South Africa. All that is needed for a successful amendment is for half of the signatory countries to support the proposal in the first instance, and for a two-thirds majority to be attained thereafter. No veto is available to objectors. Besides, the European Union has recently adopted similar legislation for its own territories. No more can be said about ecocide here during my presentation, but the campaign to amend the Statute of Rome is very much a live one, as I could explain if we were to discuss this further. Can we have the next slide, please? There is one further chapter of the book which concerns obstacles to climate and biodiversity action, including emotional ones. It is not just climate denial that obstructs global collaboration to address the problems, but despair, apathy, and cynicism. Thus, the prospects of sufficient agreement on climate action being reached are often considered remote, and many people, diplomats included, are inclined to abandon hope, while the problems can easily appear overwhelming, with the result that people turn away from them and resort to apathy. These reactions are argued to be premature, with the help of a study of John Dewey, the American philosopher, who maintains that fear, for example, is not to be universally avoided as long as it is proportionate and based on reasons, reasonable fear. And there are also reasons to be moderately hopeful. A tangible example would be the establishment at COP28 of the Loss and Damage Fund and the initial pledges to fund it. Further grounds for hope are also supplied, including the reintroduction of species that had become locally extinct, such as red kites, beavers, and sea eagles in Britain. Other obstacles include models of other countries' behavior and motivations that effectively preclude any hope of collaborative progress. A prominent one is the late Garrett Hardin's model of the tragedy of the commons, which implies that the behavior of all parties is invariably dictated by an underlying self-interest. Where there is shared pasturage, says Hardin, it always pays each stockholder to increase their stock, even though this leads to overgrazing and the ruination of the shared resources. So shared resources are perennially liable to become exhausted. Hardin's remedy is mutual coercion mutually agreed on, and to many this has seemed a reasonable remedy where resources are under pressure, as I'm sure is correct for some situations. However, Hardin rapidly applied all this to population increase and favoured a lifeboat ethic, according to which those already in a lifeboat, for which read already in a country, should not admit any of the people floundering in the water into their lifeboat, or they would all sink together, or so he claimed. While there is some place for environmental legislation to limit the unrestricted use of resources, Hardin's basis for such sensible restrictions, I should say, should itself be rejected. For there are many places in the world where shared resources are well preserved by the communities concerned. For example, in Switzerland and in many cases in places in Africa. And so it is misguided to predict that free access to resources will always be ruinous. There again, there is no reason to claim that people or countries will always do what pays them and nothing else. In case an example is needed, the acceptance of the Loss and Damage Fund at COP28 will serve again. Hardin's remedy is a kind of Hobbesian distrust of other people and other countries, from which the failure of all schemes that cannot be wholly motivated by self-interest follows. But this would mean that no substantial systems of voluntary cooperation can succeed. It is not difficult to see how Hardin's model can lead to his anti-immigration politics, but that is no reason to accept either it or them. The book accordingly argues that the model of the tragedy of the commons must be rejected in favour of more cooperation-friendly models. This is not just because it fails to fit all the facts, but this is true of models in general. It is because it supplies a model of society and of international relations that makes assumptions about motivation that are fundamentally misleading. Countries are often willing to collaborate for the common good. Another example is the adoption by the European Union of ecocide legislation for the good of both members and non-members. Hardin's realist model generates premature despair among diplomats, experts, and observers, and thus supplies an obstacle to climate agreements. But such obstacles should be firmly renounced. Can we have the last slide, please? For there are grounds for hope. The book mentions the restorations of species to regions from which they had been lost. The rise of green energy could also be cited. But besides agreeing about what should be done, we all need a fund of hope to enable us to set about doing it. And that is actually where I stop, at least for the time being.
So, thank you, Robin. Indeed, that was a powerful exposition of the issues we're faced with and the dilemmas that seem to arise in all of this everywhere. I'm going to open up to questions. It's okay. I'll stop sharing the screen, and if
Right.
people could put the hand symbol up that would be great. If you can't find that and know how to do it, then just stick your hand up so I can see it. But please do ask Robin questions now. And perhaps I could just kick off with thoughts that occurred to me. Recently, I heard very much that the legal profession is very keen that any kind of law or regulation that comes in can be applied, and there's a process behind it. Just sort of having a law against something isn't sufficient. You need to look at the whole system of law around that. And I wonder whether that applies to international agreements, very much what might be called soft law, that it's not just a matter of having ecocide on the books, it's having a process involved to actually manage and police it, essentially, and prosecute it. Have you any thoughts about that, Robin?
Yes, well, I think that means we ought to think about the International Criminal Court and whether it uh, is and is likely to continue to be effective. Well, the International Criminal Court has other crimes to consider, and not yet ecocide, but it has arraigned, it has succeeded in arraigning various people like Slobodan Milosevic for crimes of genocide. And in doing so, it is actually up against a greater obstacle than it would be with the crime of ecocide, because the framers of the law against genocide required intention to be demonstrated, and that is quite hard to do. So, in fact, those who drew up the definition of ecocide managed to avoid that, replacing that with acting in the knowledge that various bad consequences are likely. So we have actually seen quite a number of people arraigned before the International Criminal Court. Of course, there are very considerable difficulties. Milosevic, for instance, was not located, let alone arrested, for a number of years. But he was eventually, and there was a special circumstance that made that a bit more likely. Um, and those episodes are, of course, deterrents to people who break both existing and new forms of international law. But can I actually treat your question as a pretext for disclosing something which other people may have come across? It turns out that there is actually a proposal which will come to the international meeting of signatories of the Statute of Rome this December, for an ecocide amendment to be included, so that the Statute of Rome includes ecocide as well as genocide, aggression, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. And it's been proposed in the news that came to me only yesterday. Apparently, it's been proposed by Vanuatu, Fiji, and Samoa.
Mm.
And I haven't been able to check sources, but assuming that is the case, then all the various governments, including the British government, will need to decide on their posture with regard to whether they support that or not at the December meeting. And those of us who have connections with signatory states in, for instance, Africa and the Caribbean and the Pacific, may very well wish to be in touch with people in those countries so that their governments don't fail to send representatives, for
Mm.
example, to the December meeting.
Right. Yes. Thank you. Well, let's hope something happens there. Jeff, you have your hand up. Yeah.
Hi, Jeff.
Hello, Robin. Sorry I was late coming, and I've got to leave in a few minutes.
Right.
But one question about carbon tax and generally the capitalist system, where companies, the old companies, BP, for instance, had a managing director that wanted to go more into renewables, but he was forced out of that, I think, because of the shares and the fact that they operate on such a short time frame that's but then the companies have pension schemes and so forth. Do you see any moral ethic or for legislation to kind of this capitalism and actually getting more justice so that you know, the rich of the world that use 50%, well, perhaps I'm expanding too much. How do you see the company laws and carbon tax?
Right. Well,
Mm.
um, while it might be desirable to overthrow capitalism, the problems that I've been mentioning can't actually wait for that to happen. And within the capitalist system, there are different forces. So there are, as you've been mentioning, oil and gas companies which have been resisting all kinds of carbon taxes, and also some years ago resisted the introduction of ecocide as an international crime. But there are also considerable considerable companies, such as insurance companies, and often also pension schemes, which you mentioned, which are open to lobbying and have often taken a quite constructive role. But insurance companies, understandably, want the future to be as secure as possible and don't want people's lives to be subverted by flooding and storms and the like. So actually, it's not utterly hopeless to be lobbying, even in a situation when business is capitalist organized. About a carbon tax, I would be sympathetic to carbon taxes, but that's one of the various options that particular states and clusters of states, such as the European Union, have. But I think I'd better not launch into trying to talk about a carbon tax just beyond that at the moment. After all, we've had three people attempting to phone me during this presentation, and for all I know, it might generate some more.
Thank you.
Thank you. Right. James, did you want to ask a question there? Or
Yes, I did. My internet is kept going on and off. There was part of one of the slides about the Ottoman Empire. I was just wondering can you explain what that was about, what you said?
Yes, well, the topic just there was whether climate justice involves those who pay being the actual polluters, whether individuals or states or other levels in between, or something different. And it is an extremely popular and appealing slogan that polluters should pay. But what I was saying just there was that quite a lot of polluters are no longer around, whether through individual polluters having simply died, or through states that were polluting to whatever extent, no longer existing. And the Ottoman Empire was one where nobody would object to the view that it no longer exists. So there are states which have been responsible for pollution. No doubt the Ottoman Empire was nothing like as responsible for that as various more recent empires, where you just couldn't have a system in which it was the actual polluters who pay. So at that point, I was arguing that instead, states which are capable, which have the ability to pay, since it's in their interest to have an international agreement, should actually be willing to take part. And that has actually, in effect, been adopted in recent COP conferences, because all countries have been invited to make their so-called nationally determined contributions. But that's not itself unproblematic, because when you add up these contributions, they would still continue to produce greater emissions than would be satisfactory, even though that will be smaller emissions than at the current rate with business as usual. So in fact, we need to further adjust those nationally determined contributions, and that is going to come up at the COP conference this November.
Okay.
right.
I understand your reply.
Thank you. Good. Anyone else here? Kia, you put a very interesting question in the chat. Would you like to ask it, maybe?
I think last time I was in here, I had audio problems, so I wanted to hedge my bets. Can you hear me?
Yes, indeed, yes.
Fantastic. I'm coming from the University of Plymouth. I'm a PhD student looking at education for sustainable development. And
Did you say again which university?
University of Plymouth.
Oh, right.
Yeah. And my question was, how do we begin having real conversations about climate ethics to raise awareness whilst mitigating against defensiveness and disengagement? Many individuals, especially everyday citizens who don't come into the expertise that many of you in this call, I assume, have, may take what's intended as a very genuine communication on serious matters and the idea of like accountability on a wider scale as a personal attack for deference or inaction.
Right, thank you. Well, it's difficult to produce prescriptions for how to have conversations when the people that we have conversations with are so extremely varied. So I think we would need to let's try to subdivide the people that we might wish to have conversations with. So there will be there will to start at the easier end be members of groups that in theory believe in mitigating climate change, but in practice don't do so because either they haven't thought through the practicalities, or they're suffering from apathy or the like. So in those cases, possibly people need to be reminded of the principles to which they implicitly adhere, and also to what can be attained by shared action. But there will also be other people who, as you say, may feel attacked, and there'll be people in between who I think this is a widespread view, think that all these issues are somehow or other issues for the future. Now, what those people may need to be shown, by the way, cheerio to Jeff, who's having to leave. What those people may need to be have pointed out to him is that actually climate change is affecting us already, and that there are there are floods in here and droughts there, and they're bringing climate refugees knocking on our doors and shores, it's an illusion to hold that it's just a problem for the future. Though, of course, if it were just a problem for the future, that would still be a reason for taking action. But the people who probably the hardest people to talk to would be the people that you mentioned, who feel personally affronted by any suggestion of any change, and that's, I suppose, been a problem for the advocates of change from, for instance, Cromwell onwards. If it will vary. I mean, it's to some extent they need to be shown grounds for hope and for collaboration, and how they can be effective, and I suppose also it can be argued that the proposals for change are not a sort of recrimination about actions that people have recently been taking, but are part of a new future in which they can participate, or at least dip their toe if willing. I'm trying to do mass psychology impromptu, and that's the best I can come up with.
I'm very understanding of the fact that if there was an easy answer, we'd all be doing it. So I think you did fantastic with that. Thank you so much.
Well, and of course, one of the things that we can do is write things. So you were talking about conversations, but my chances of having an impact on people, say, across the Atlantic, granted that I don't travel there because of my carbon footprint, depend on finding out some other mode of communication, and writing things is one possibility.
Thank you. Has anyone else got any question? Daniel.
Man.
Hi, Robin. Thanks for that. That was really interesting. I don't know if you saw from the chat that one of my colleagues at the Bristol Law School has just been invited recently. He doesn't have a background in this area, but he's a philosopher and writes a lot about public health ethics. And he's just been invited by the World Health Organization to advise them, or sit on a technical advisory group on climate health. So I just wonder how much you've engaged with the health community in this space. There's obviously a growing, well, I don't know, there's obviously, but there's a over recent years there's been a movement, if you like, which presumably some of you have heard of, if not all of you, called planetary health, and it's the sort of integration.
Yes.
Yeah. So I'm just wondering if you could say a few words about how, the integration of health in this space.
Right. Well, the planetary health is the theme of there's a Cardiff University group of researchers who claim to be working on planetary health, and trying to find allies and links. But actually, when you said your colleagues, is that Bristol University?
Yes.
Yeah, right. I'm sorry, I'm guessing because I didn't know. Now, how much have I engaged? Well, I think deplorably little, but I have engaged with one or two people because I went to a conference in the southern part of the Czech Republic at Pilsen, just before COVID, I think, or a couple of years before COVID, probably, and so we were there concerned with all kinds of pollution and various emissions. And the guy who was running the conference wrote a great deal about air pollution, which is, I think, what brought my interest in that direction. So I can't think of his name. There is a community that studies health impacts, whether from metal poisoning or from particulates or air pollution, or there again, of course, pollution by plastics. But I think that your question is more about air pollution, I think. While there are some international standards, they are universally dishonored, not to say disregarded. And there are statistics, you can look it up on Google. There is a whole array of world capitals, Beijing, St. Petersburg, Ashgabat, and non-capitals. I mean, at one stage, the most polluted city in the world was Onitsha on the river Niger, which has all sorts of chemical pollution, and it has transport crossing the river Niger because there happens to be a bridge there, one of the lowest bridges down from the delta. So there is strong grounds for concern, and of course, what that involves is that medical training should relate to how to cope with different sorts of conditions resulting from some such emissions. So that involves nursing training as well, and then local authorities should be encouraged to bear all this in mind in the various codes that are issued, and from the point of view of health professionals, this is of course the main relevant area with respect to climate change. I think it's a fractional area, but it's still a very important one. So I welcome what you're saying, and I'm glad to hear about what he's doing. Well, I've published a little here and there about air pollution, but when people then ask me to do some more, I, on the whole, tell them that I don't know enough about it.
That's really useful. Thank you. I mean, yeah, it's definitely not just air pollution. There's a massive and growing body of evidence linking various different climate-related impacts to health outcomes. But it is amazing that it's only just now that people are starting to think about the ethics of that interrelationship between climate and health. So I'll put you in touch. I'll send an email after this and introduce you.
Thank you very much.
Perhaps we could talk more about that as well, Dan. Sounds
Yeah,
very
that'd be great.
neat. Yep.
Yes, that could be the topic of future presentations of the
absolutely.
Schumacher Institute.
Yes. Thank you. John, you hand up there.
Thank you very much for your very, very interesting talk. I'm interested in your views on equality and inequality. You know, it's well known that the more affluent classes in both the global north and the global south are the heaviest emitters of carbon and have the largest environmental impact on the planet. To what extent do you think the ethics of climate change is tied up with the ethics or the ethics of inequality?
A very great deal. I was mentioning poverty from time to time, and of course that's a strong instance of inequality, granted the imbalance between the incomes of the different peoples and different people in the same country. And we have to bear this in mind. I mean, at one point, actually, I was saying that we all have obligations to do what we can, but of course, the obligations of people with limited resources and opportunities perforce less than those of people with greater opportunities and purchasing power and bargaining power. So that's one of the relevancies. But but a more central and direct relevance is the inequality between people in places which are severely at risk from extreme weather events and people which are less so. Now, you could claim that was evening up with extreme weather events reaching European countries to an increasing extent, but it has in the past been one where it's various, for instance, Pacific states are in such a parlous condition that their inhabitants are all going to be homeless, which is a rather severe kind of inequality. So there are many ways in which equality and inequality are relevant to these issues, and of course they all have a bearing on global justice as well. But we should not forget that there are issues of equality between different species as well, and that those of us who are anything like sympathetic to biocentrism must need to bear that in mind. And we are in some danger of undermining the habitats of all kinds of species while extending our own. And that genuinely is an issue of equality, and needs mentioning as well.
Thank you. Right. If anybody else got a question, please ask now, or I'll just like to pick up one if I can.
I should say I haven't been able to look at the chat, so there may be interesting things in the chat, but I was not at leisure to look at it.
Well, yeah, I think we picked up on most things there, Robin. And I think if anybody else has put something in there that I'd like to ask, please ask now. I was going to maybe come back a little bit to ecocide area and possibly relate it to what Keir was saying. It strikes me that you were talking about genocide and people like Milosevic, etc., who are identifiable individuals who can be held responsible and punished. For ecocide, it's often not a person, it's a system that's done it. How do we hold systems responsible in that frame, and how can we punish a system when in fact you and I are part of that system, if you consider the boundaries extending right the way through to the not just past the pension funds, even to the consumption that we take part in every day without even knowing the consequences of it. So how do we deal with that dispersed collective responsibility that is producing what we call ecocide?
Right. Well, one of the problems of ethics is dealing with informal collectives, whether we are the collective or whether it's a vague mass of other people. And I think the short first answer is that we cannot punish systems. But on the other hand, there are decisions taken by governments, by alliances of countries, and also decisions taken by multinational companies and by alliances of companies where decisions are traceable to particular agreements and policies which have dates to them and indirectly places to them. And so we shouldn't sort of surrender in face of these interesting philosophical thoughts about the ineluctability of systems, because there are the institutions that make up that contribute to systems where the proposal, of course, with ecocide is that officers with great power can be held to account. And we, of course, there are some limits to that. We can't we can't sort of take to court those who promoted the Corn Laws, unjust as they were, because they're dead. And there are some people whose countries refuse to take part in the International Criminal Court, though, as I was mentioning, they would still be affected by new international laws. But this doesn't mean that nothing whatever can be done. In fact, the world is quite a different one from the world that there would be if there were no International Criminal Court, and it can be, and the International Criminal Court could be a really salient, is weapon the right word, in the armory of climate activists.
Right.
So I think the fact that there will be ineluctable components of systems which are beyond retrieval shouldn't lead us to give up hope, because there are so many agents that could be held accountable.
Right. And again, ignorance of the laws is no excuse, I guess, for those at the top.
Right. Well, that's an interesting point. With regard to ecocide, both companies and governments with any degree of power have all sorts of experts and advising them and pay for the best advice, and are likely to be told by their legal department what the existing state of both national and international law is. And so if they act in ways likely to cause long-lasting or widespread severe environmental destruction, they are likely to be they're likely to be in a position where they can be informed about that, and therefore the prospects of a defense of ignorance are getting pretty slim.
Yeah. Good.
I mean, if these laws really were ones which focused on ordinary private individuals and or small shops or something like that, then of course there would be lots of people who could claim ignorance of the law. It's just that it's a misunderstanding of the proposed crime of ecocide to suggest that those are the parties that are being targeted. They're not.
Good. Well, I'd just like to point out that we have signed up to the Ecocide Alliance, so we are part of that as the institute.
It's we the Schumacher Institute.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. So
right.
we are fully supporting the movement towards that.
Okay. Well, the Schumacher Institute itself then would be one of those who can write to, for instance, whichever local MP is the relevant local MP.
Yeah.
Urging them to ask the Foreign Office to support
it.
The Ecocide Amendment.
Right. Excellent.
And indeed, there's a risk, because if less than 50% of the 123 members support this, then not only does the amendment fall, but also it won't be allowed to be resurrected for several years.
Yeah, that's the trouble, isn't it?
So in fact, so assuming that it's correct, the report that Vanuatu, Fiji, and Samoa have proposed an amendment, it becomes urgent that there should be that as many countries as possible who are signatories should be urged to attend, take part, and vote.
Yeah.
David George has a point.
Oh, David, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Robin, for this. I appreciate it. It's very, very interesting. I suppose my question is, given the apathy and cynicism and misinterest that I've come across in the last 3 or 4 years, specifically about climate change, ecocide, and all the rest of it, what do you think the chances are in this country of the current, this new government actually doing what would be the right thing? Because my good news is there is no such thing as climate change unless it happens to you.
No.
And where I live on the Isle of Wight, and we had this huge coastal failure in December. 54 million metric tons of cliff fell. It didn't fall in a landslide. It wasn't a slope. It was an elevator.
Mm.
It closed the main A road. No one was killed. It was absolutely miraculous that nobody was killed in this. It's 0.8 miles away from where I'm sitting. So it makes you kind of a bit more interested. I was interested anyway, but I'm really more interested. But what do you think? What do you think the government's going to do?
A mutual friend of ours relates that Keir Starmer was himself highly interested in the drafting in the draft, and was interested in hearing about the process of the draft from the relevant lawyer of Stop Ecocide International. I'm not going to rest too much on that, because there are so many pressures that are going to be applied. So I suppose what is likely to happen is that the various business lobbies will be likely to be urging British government to, from their perspective, do nothing, just abstain, because I mean they don't want to be inflammatory and they don't want to stir things up unduly, but if they can militate in the direction of doing nothing, they will be well satisfied. But on the other hand, sorry, what's the name of the Foreign Secretary? I can't remember.
David Lammy.
David Lammy, my wife tells me. David Lammy was saying the other day that climate change action was going to be central to British foreign policy in the coming period, and so that is promising. And of course there are all various forces and factors, not including central Quaker bodies, it turns out, but including all sorts of Quaker area meetings, which can get active and begin pressurising their local parliamentary representatives.
My view is if it's good enough for the Pope, because he's come out and said, well, yes.
Yes, well, yes, and we can add on the ecumenical patriarch of the World Council of Churches and the Swedish bishops, and of course but perhaps the moral of that bit is that there is civil society, which is likely to be fairly concerned. So I think actually the business lobby might have a hard time on this matter.
Right. Let's keep our fingers crossed. And at that point, I'll say a big thank you to Robin for a lovely talk, and all good luck with the book, and all good luck with your campaigns and pressure and everything else in the future. And a thank you to everybody for coming along and asking some lovely questions as well. Please keep tuned in to the Institute's workshops. I'm not quite sure what's going next, but there's I can hardly keep up with them. So I'm sure
there's another one in a fortnight or so, isn't there?
There is indeed, yes. So we've got a good program ahead of us. I need to look it up. I'm afraid I forgot what it is, but it's always going to be interesting. And so I'd say once again, thank you to Robin, and thank you to everybody here. And take care of yourselves.
It would be very interesting to discover who were the people, the roughly the same number of people as are present who registered and are absent.
Yes.
But at least their potential interest is encouraging.
We do capture them all, and I wouldn't be surprised if one or two of them decided that it was such a sunny day they went to sleep in the deck chair outside to catch the last.
Yes, that could well be.
Right. Okay. Thank you, everybody, and yeah, as I say, enjoy yourselves and take care, and have some hope. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you very much.
Okay. Good.